So we have some important new developments in a Supreme Court case that could reshape when the federal government can be held accountable for botched law enforcement raids. This all comes out of the case where the FBI decided to smash in the front door of the wrong house, terrorize an innocent family, and now the government is still trying to avoid responsibility, even after losing already unanimously 9-0 at the Supreme Court on this very issue. But now the family is firing back and pushing back against what the Trump DOJ and the FBI are trying to say in this case in their current efforts to dodge that 9-0 unanimous decision that was issued by the Supreme Court. So let's break down what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. About 60% of all viewers are actually not subscribed to the channel. So if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to give you as much as possible as a member. Recently, they released the information that you're guaranteed 4 attorneys for your self-defense case. And then also recently at the conference, they included the Hero Clause, which gives you even more coverage. So if you're interested, check them out using the link down below. And if you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $25 off of your sign-up fee. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the Martin family. Back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area. Now, the only problem was that they raided the wrong home. Agents were supposed to go to a specific address, but instead they decided to rely on a personal GPS, device, I believe a phone, and it ended up taking them to the completely wrong address where actually Katrina Martin lived with her boyfriend and their young child. And they lived in a home 3 doors down from where the FBI was actually supposed to go. The FBI decided to smash in the front door. They detonated flashbang grenades, pointed guns at the family, detained them, and also dragged Katrina Martin out half naked. Now, only later when they were kind of reviewing the home and going through some of the items, they found a piece of mail on a coffee table, I believe, saw that the address was the correct address for that location. And so they said, oh, we raided the wrong home. And that's kind of when they had that huge oh crap moment. The FBI then left the home, told them that they would be back to explain, and then they went 3 doors down to the correct home and then raided that area where they were supposed to actually be. The family, in response to this, sued the FBI under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, and that is the law that allows citizens to sue the federal government when its employees committed wrongful acts. But the government, in response, claimed that they had immunity using something called the discretionary function exception to the FTCA, and they argued that how the raid was planned involved discretion and policy judgment. Both the district court and also the 11th Circuit originally agreed with the FBI and the federal government. But eventually, this case made its way to the Supreme Court, and recently, just last year, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. Justice Gorsuch wrote the opinion, and he wrote that the 11th Circuit applied the discretionary function exception far too broadly in order that the court needed to take a fresh look at whether the FBI's actions were actually protected by law. In short, the Supreme Court said that you don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. You must show that those decisions were grounded in legitimate policy choices. And now this case is currently moving forward at the 11th Circuit level. After the Supreme Court sent the case back down, the DOJ filed a new brief to the 11th Circuit, arguing that the case should still be dismissed and essentially should still come out the same way despite that 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court. This is now set for arguments in front of the 11th Circuit on March 25th, so the 11th Circuit will now hear arguments in this critical case. The government now claims that the agent's mistakes flowed from discretionary decisions about surveillance, navigation, and approach tactics. They argue that no statute or rule specifically dictated how these agents had to identify the house. And therefore, they say that the discretionary function exception still blocks this lawsuit despite what the Supreme Court just said. In other words, the DOJ is trying to preserve immunity by repackaging the same argument that the Supreme Court actually just rejected. But now the family has responded to that DOJ position, and they are arguing that the 11th Circuit needs to do exactly what the Supreme Court said, which is to take a serious look at this case. The family argues that the federal government cannot hide behind the discretionary function exception for basic operational failures. Their core argument in this case is very simple, Essentially, executing a warrant at the correct address is not a policy decision. It is actually a ministerial duty. And that is something where there is no discretion at all. The federal agents do not have discretion to raid the wrong home or to not check the warrant and get the proper address. The family says that the discretionary function exception was meant to protect actual policy judgments, not reckless mistakes like ignoring the address on a warrant and trusting a personal GPS device instead. The brief argues that raiding the wrong home, traumatizing an innocent family, and pointing guns at the family is not grounded in any legitimate federal policy. And so they also argue that once that shield is removed, after that exception to the FTCA is gone, the basic FTCA rules will then apply, and this is an easy win for the family, and this case should be allowed to move forward. They argue that without the FTCA, the consideration would be based on Georgia state law, and that would be if a private person would be liable under the state law for this conduct, well then the United States is also liable as well. And under ordinary tort law, kicking in the wrong door or the front door of the wrong house would clearly trigger liability. The Martins also argue that the DOJ's position would create some dangerous consequences. If accepted, that would mean that any law enforcement raid could be insulated from lawsuits simply by labeling every single mistake as discretion. Wrong house raids would then automatically be immune from accountability, and victims would have no legal remedy at all for even the most reckless conduct performed by law enforcement officers. That would expand government immunity far beyond what Congress ever intended when it passed the FTCA, and far beyond what the Supreme Court just allowed in their unanimous ruling. So where does this currently leave us in this case? Well, we now have a unanimous Supreme Court ruling narrowing government immunity. The DOJ in this case is still trying to avoid that accountability, and they're pushing for the 11th Circuit to simply just issue the same ruling despite what the Supreme Court just said. But the family is pushing back against that, and they're saying that the 11th Circuit needs to listen to what the Supreme Court just said and take a fresh, clean look at this case, look at what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 ruling, look at the facts of this case, and determine if the FBI could be accountable for this and if this case should be allowed to move forward. This case is no longer just about one family. It's about whether federal agents can be held responsible when they invade the wrong home, or whether the government can also escape liability by calling every single mistake discretion. The Supreme Court made clear that the lower courts must draw a very real line here in this case, and now the 11th Circuit has set oral arguments in this case for the week of March 25th. And so this is going to happen very soon, and we're going to see if the 11th Circuit is going to take the decision by the Supreme Court serious and actually analyze this case correctly. So that's where things currently stand right now in this critical Supreme Court accountability case. The DOJ continues to fight to preserve immunity. The Martins continue to push back, and the 11th Circuit must now apply the Supreme Court's ruling and decide whether this case goes to trial. But the DOJ, like I mentioned, is doubling down in trying to repackage the same arguments that were already rejected by the Supreme Court. So as soon as we get more information as the oral arguments develop, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm, just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of 2A content, and so it shares it to more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.